Okay, so we are halfway through chapter 5. Chapter 5. So we just gone and we had gone through how Mann was laying out power organizations. Power organizations determine the structure and transformation of society. And today we're going to hit into classes as economic power organizations. Okay, so Kyle, do you want to open up and take the first slide for us?
Sure thing. Classes in this framework are a particular kind of collective actor formed into organizations that deploy economic power resources. Mann does not, however, provide a compact definition of class organizations so that one would know for sure that a particular economic power organization was an instance of a quote-unquote class organization, as opposed to some other kind of economic power organization. The closest we get is statements that point to classes as economic power organizations whose economic power is derived from, quote, rights over economic resources. Sections are subdivisions of classes. They acquire their conceptual status as a section by virtue of being nested within a class organization. Segments are economic power organizations that combine heterogeneous sets of rights over economic resources. This is what it means to say that segments cross-cut classes.
Okay, so what's he saying here about sections and segments, Kyle?
I mean, Wright is basically calling him out, right? Because he's like, well, you don't define what a class organization is other than maybe a class. And then sections are subdivisions of classes, which are nested within a class organization. But if the only instance of a class organization is a class, then how could they be nested within it? It doesn't make sense. And then we have the segments that are basically like hybrid cross-class economic power organizations, like, I don't know, you could say like political parties, right?
I was going to say, yeah, party, right? Like,
but it would have to be like, you know, say the Chinese Communist Party, right? Like has like a very strong economic dimension as well as being a political cross-class organization.
And I got a question, Kyle, or for you, Tom. Like when I read sections, am I misinterpreting this to translate that into fractions? Like it just reminds me of like, you know, like a class fraction, like, you know, capital is divided into multiple fractions kind of related to sectors, and even particular sectors might have fractions. Like I study the oil industry in Canada, and it's like, you know, there's large capital firms that are in particular places within relations of fossil fuel production. There's like the smaller driller organizations. They're different fractions, but they might unite within particular organizations. So I guess one question I have is whether or not sections can be read that way, because that's the only way it makes tons of sense to me. And then the second thing, I'm curious, that I have difficulty through the rest of the chapter, like what does Mann really mean by a class organization? Is that just is he talking about actual organizations like a network of trade unions? Or
I think he's trying to talk about, like, when he's talking about classes here as economic power organizations, as classes for themselves, as opposed to classes, in themselves, you know, that kind of Marxist distinction. That's what I think. Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong. Like with sections here, I think your fraction would be a section, but a section doesn't necessarily need to be a fraction.
Okay.
So like as in the section could just be groups of workers across different actual industries. There could be some kind of organization that wouldn't actually be like a fraction of capital linked to it, say.
I think Mann wants it to mean something different than a fraction, like being something that has other potential applications. But the only examples he provides are classes, and sections of classes would be class fractions. So they're effectively identical, even though Mann would suggest they're not, because you could have, I don't know, some other kind of economic power organization that he doesn't specify, which has sections of it. But in practice, they are just class fractions, yes.
But like, take for example something like, say, a typical right-wing, like dominant party, like the Tory party in England. It's not the case that the Tory party is made up just of like bourgeois business owners. It's also got a working class base of membership.
Yeah, but it's
too.
also not an economic power organization, right?
Okay, but we did not say political organizations earlier.
No, that's why I was saying it had to be something like the Chinese Communist Party, where it's like literally a economic organization as well as a political one.
Cool.
Like you'd have to have like some kind of Bonapartist economic planning situation going on to have something like that.
Okay. So here's a question, and it's related to something that I suspect I'll bring back in a little bit later as Wright develops his critique of Mann, especially the implications. It's especially like what he directly says in terms of his framework for class, and then the actual practicality of how he applies it. Wright goes on to critique this, but like, would, for instance, an industry association or a chamber of commerce be an example?
I think you could. So this is just an extrapolation. It's not something Mann actually says, but I think like a reasonable example of an economic power organization that is not a class would be something like OPEC, because OPEC has like literal rights over economic resources, whereas a chamber of commerce, it wouldn't make use of its economic rights as a corporate entity. It would only, like, the individual corporations that make up the Chamber of Commerce would do that, right? And whereas like OPEC, it's a cartel, so they literally have to do things in concert in order for it to be effective.
It could be kind of, I think, like, could you think of like the Chamber of Commerce thing as kind of quasi? Like,
it's very close, but I would say
exactly what Mann is talking about.
Yeah, if we want to follow the definition. Oh, sorry. No, I'm getting confused because you're completely right. Because they would be an economic power organization, but according to Mann's definition of a class, we would actually see OPEC as a class as well. Because it's an economic power organization whose economic power is derived from rights over economic resources.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Because the reason I like the OPEC example. The reason I go to things like Chamber of Commerce or industry associations is that as we proceed, Wright is going to call out Mann, right, for like essentially not having any meaningful way to explain how a members of a class actually come to form some kind of like collective identity and the capacity to exert collective action. And because I study capitalist class organizing, it's like, in my mind, it's like, oh yeah, like various capitalist class fractions have all sorts of organizations and have developed them over time precisely because they don't all the individual actors are in competition with each other in the marketplace, even if they're also relatively united against workers. And they need means in order to determine some kind of collective interest that they can pursue politically, right?
Yeah, that would match the sort of vaguely defined idea of an economic power organization. Yes.
Okay, Kyle, do you want to keep going with this section?
Understood this way, the core agenda of class analysis is understanding the patterns of formation of classes as power organizations and how these have developed historically. So again, remember, we're talking about classes as power organizations being roughly equivalent to the idea of the class for itself. In most of human history, Mann claims that classes were not the main form of economic power organizations. Until recently, segments and sections usually predominated over classes. Classes were generally only quote-unquote latent owners, that is, like the class in itself. Laborers and others struggled, but usually semi-covertly, intensively, confined to an everyday local level. Most extensive struggle was between segments. Classes in this framework are a particular kind of collective actor formed into organizations that deploy economic power resources. So this is he's not saying, I don't think that segments are classes, but rather that in contrast to the segments, classes are a kind of collective actor formed into organizations that deploy economic power resources. The main story about classes in the course of the development of capitalism is the gradual emergence of class as the predominant form of economic power organization, first among capitalists and then later among laborers. While no capitalist society reached the point predicted by Marx of fully polarized, symmetrical, extensive class organizations engaged in a head-on dialectical struggle with one another, capitalist development did generate a predominance of class organization and at least some tendencies towards extensive forms of class conflict.
Right. Where do we start with this? Like, if we were to look at feudalism, do we not see like classes operating in feudalism? Do we not see the feudal landlords were operating as a class? They may be intra-feudal warfare, but like that can be, like, is that not analogous to intrastate capitalist warfare or intra-firm capitalist warfare?
I would say that in feudalism, the strongest expression you get of like a self-conscious class organization is when you see these little eruptions of capitalism that are trying to overthrow the feudal order. And the reaction against that tends to be like of a class nature, right? There is a sort of, you see these kinds of like collective feudal efforts to put down bourgeois revolts. And other than that, I think it is, I mean,
I have a question, Kyle. What about even the existence of a king or, of a royalty as a class kind of compromise between feuding feudal warlords? That like is the kingdom itself not shows that there is class activity?
I mean, there's definitely class activity. The question is whether it is a class in it or a class for itself. That's the question, right? Like, as opposed to sort of unconsciously individual monarchs fighting against the church for their secular power, a collective of monarchs trying to suppress the power of the church as like, this is in favor of secular feudal power, right? So, because absolutely there is class struggle going on in feudalism, but class organization, I think it happens sometimes, but it's not the main form of social conflict, I wouldn't think. Yeah, maybe
under feudalism.
Yeah, under feudalism. There's maybe like you could look at like guild interests, but I don't know. Guild interests, like I think as Marx points out, are quite internally divided between the masters and the journeymen, right? That's a corporate interest that the guilds would fight for as opposed to a class interest, because it's a what do you call it here in this analysis? A segment of the masters and the journeymen. Like feudal society was really messy and complicated. That's why I'm hesitant to say that you see self-conscious class organization. I mean, except for like peasant revolts, right?
Well, this
like,
is
peasant
kind of
revolts
what
are pretty straightforward a class organization.
And did feudal like lords and aristocrats, like the aristocratic class, like would they ever team like start coordinating when they were worried about revolts, or did they continue being in competition with each other? Because like one of the interesting things I would argue about capitalist class power, and that I actually think comes out of this chapter and some or this interesting things to tease out in his kind of, I guess, critical engagement with Mann, right, is that like capitalists under capitalism are like the reason why they tend to form kind of like political power organizations or whatever you want to call them is because the structure of the market means that even though their power is based on exploitation of workers, they are also often in competition with each other in the market. And they actually like require organizational forms that can allow them to pursue their collective interests and even come to understand what their collective interests are vis-a-vis other classes. And that's kind of like what the political scientist Fred Fisher used to call like a rolling consensus. Like that's what those sorts of organizations do. But it seems from the way you're describing it is that like under feudalism, maybe the aristocratic class doesn't have that level of self-conscious organization. And that's an organization that under capitalism, I would argue, doesn't emerge. This is Mann's problem, I think, in terms of this, the way it's described in this chapter is like capitalists or workers don't necessarily spontaneously develop that shared understanding. There's usually some kind of political struggle, some kind of organizational attempts. There are fractions of members within classes. You know, Gramsci called them organic intellectuals that work to organize other members. Mm-hmm. And it's not really immediately obvious from the outstart, even if they're sharing a similar structural position within relations to production, there tends to be some kind of political labor almost that goes.
Yeah, I think that maybe it didn't start out as this, but maybe you could see the Holy Roman Empire as a kind of feudal collective actor, right? Because like once the emperor, like there's sort of that middle period where like the Habsburgs aren't like super overly predominant in their power, but the power of the Holy Roman Emperor has also been checked, that like the HRE is kind of existing as a club for feudal lords to have their little petty bits of property and exploit their peasants and kind of work together to protect that economic resource, right? Those economic rights. So I think that there is like that would probably be the strongest one I could point to in terms of like a self-conscious feudal class organization, even though it wasn't founded with that in mind, right? It was founded to be like literally just a normal ass empire.
We've got to eventually it's like, oh, we need to rationalize the different factions of the ruling classes of Europe, because if not, we're not going to be able to maintain, like there's going to be chaos or we're going to lose our positions.
Yeah, like, oh, we're all these little tiny lords. How are we going to stand up against France? You know, how are we going to stand up against Poland? You know, and we don't want a Holy Roman Emperor running the show and telling us what to do. But if we do keep this collective organization around, then we can kind of do like collective self-defense of our feudal property.
How does something like the Magna Carta fit into this? Like,
but then you're already like,
now you're already at the tail end of feudalism. Feudalism.
Yes, exactly. It's like that is certainly a like a conscious class effort among the aristocracy to check royal power. But I don't know if it corresponds to a what you would call like an actual organization that's like ongoing and a class organization. I think you don't really see the emergence of like the Tory party as an aristocratic class organization until you start to see the emergence of capitalism, right? There were like some members of the aristocracy who were Whigs, but they tended to have more diversified economic interests than the Tories, who were moored into their like, you know, feudal landownings.
Is there any other points in this slide that we haven't? I think we've dealt with it all, haven't we?
I mean, I guess just generally to say, like, what Mann is saying here basically corresponds to what Marx lays out at the start of Capital in terms of a theory of history and class development, right? That it's not until you get capitalism that, like, the sort of key to history is unlocked and revealed. Before that, things are just very confused between a bunch of different like segmental struggles that obscure the class conflict.
Okay, I'll take this next bit. Continuing in this vein of argumentation, Mann's class analysis is thus firmly anchored in the third conceptual cluster of class analysis we discussed earlier, the relations between classes. He goes further, rejecting the usefulness of any systematic analysis of the objective relational aspects of class structures. Commenting on Marx's discussion of capitalists and proletarians as economically defined classes, he writes, such classes might be considered objective, but we might choose to define classes by other objective, inverted commas, criteria. So-called industrial society theorists distinguish classes according to their specialized role in the division of labor, which method yields numerous occupational classes. Weberians identify classes according to market capacities, producing many classes based on ownership of property, scarce job skills, professional powers, and educational levels. How do we choose among these equally, inverted commas, objective schemes? The economic without organizational criteria gives only what I term latent class, corresponding roughly to the term objective class or class in itself. Such a latent class is of little sociological interest. Theorists may develop what analytical categories they like as ideal types, but only some of these help explain the real world. If classes are significant power actors in the real world, they must be organized extensively or politically. So this is getting to your point. This is the point you made earlier.
Yeah, no, I think so. It's like Mann is really, because like it's very interesting because like the very first I've been annotating my PDF of the book, and like the very first page I just wrote, like I just put a little comment like in itself for itself question mark, like what's going on there, right? Like, and it seems that like what he's doing here, or the way that Wright frames what he's doing here, it's like he's calling out, maybe I'm stretching the metaphor a little too far, but it's what I always call it. Sometimes like I used to call my students when people still used to watch the cartoon South Park, underpants gnome logic, right? Like there's an episode of South Park where like there's like these underpants gnomes who like steal the kids' underpants where they're asleep. And it's supposed to be just like a riff on the idea that like you lose socks and underwear in like the laundry machine. You never really know where they go, right? And like they like track the underpants gnomes like underneath to like their underground layer. And they're trying to figure out like, well, why are you stealing everyone's underpants? They look like these little lawn gnomes or whatever, right? And they're like, oh yeah, well, we've got like this 3-point plan to profit, right? And it's like step 1 is steal underpants. And then like step 2 is like question mark. It just says question mark. And then step 3 is profit.
Yeah.
Right. Mann's trying to go straight from stealing underpants to profit. Like it's like, well, how the heck do they gain the capacity to act collectively in organizations, whether as an economic power organization that defines a class, or whether or not an organization that is a segment that brings different people from different classes? Like there has to be some connection between people's capacity, like a class's capacity or members of a class's capacity to act collectively within an organization and their position within relations of production. And if not, what are you studying? Like, why not just be a pluralist like Robert Dahl? Like, I don't really understand. Like, why not just be a liberal? Like, what's the point of doing class analysis? It feels weird to me. It feels like a weird framework. I don't understand how he's getting to the profit part of the underpants gnome equation. Yeah.
Is Mann a liberal?
I don't know. I just know about him from this chapter. He seems kind of lib, but like trying to make use of like some of Marx's ideas. Yeah.
How do you write a sentence like this? Like the one I've highlighted, such a latent class.
I mean, you have to be an academic to write something so incredibly stupid.
It makes no sense, right? Like, and to be clear, I'm not saying I think Mann's a liberal. I'm just saying that there are assumptions there that don't make sense. Like what he's what he's trying to analyze doesn't make a lot of sense if what he says is of little sociological interest is actually of little sociological interest.
Yeah, I would suggest
who joins. Like, what's the logic behind who joins them? Right? Like, why not just roll a dice and then pick a name out of the phone book and ask them to join your union organization? It's
a stochastic, theory of class.
I would suggest that like Mann's arguments here are motivated not by his class interest, but by his sectional interest as an academic careerist. That he's really just trying to stir up controversy in order to make a controversy around himself. that like this is so incredibly stupid that it's like almost beneath comment.
Yeah.
But somehow these things happen where people like take a reasonable theory, like, you know, Marxist theory, and then just cut out one of the core sections and is like, oh, it's my new theory that makes no sense at all, but I'm just going to mind fuck everybody by saying this like it makes sense.
Well, I remember, like, Kyle, I think you and we've talked before about like Terry Eagleton's book on his ideology primer, right? Like ideology
Right.
introduction. And there's this great section. I always come back to it where he's trying to go after like the post-Marxists like Laclau and Mouffe and so on, who essentially see no meaningful connection to people's position within relations of production in terms of which groups are likely to join up with other groups in a socialist movement or a populist movement or whatever.
Just like hyper Leninism, right? Like,
yeah,
like they're like all that matters is the political.
That's
the
right.
Economic is irrelevant.
That's right. And I think what those sorts of things are trying to do, there's a certain logic to it in the sense that, like, as you start realizing there's no necessary one-to-one connection between being in a particular class position and a particular ideological self-understanding that you're guaranteed to have, right? But as Eagleton points out, there's a difference between saying there's necessarily no connection between your position within relations production and your self-understanding as a class, and saying that there is necessarily no connection, right? Like there's no, there's no necessary connection and necessarily no connection. Because he's like, well, if there's literally no connection, why don't, like, between your positions and relations of production and the political movements and you're likely to be part of and the organizations you're likely to be part of, why don't socialists just pool all of their money and just like target the like 10 wealthiest billionaires on the planet and try to convince them to be socialists with like a really good framing campaign?
Yeah. Not that it hasn't been tried, but yeah.
But the second you ask that question, it becomes immediately apparent that this is a ridiculous concept, right? Like that is not a good use of your political resources and energy to try to convince Elon Musk to joining the socialist vanguard.
Maybe they're kids. You know, that's who you're more likely to get. You know, rich heirs. Didn't Ralph Nader write a book on like the title like something like "Only the Billionaire Can Save Us Now"? Literally making the pitch to switch a billionaire over into our class and then we can use his money.
It's not to say that you don't have individual, extremely wealthy people who become socialists or communists. Like, you know, obviously there's like Engels, but like, you know,
he's not that wealthy, you know.
No, I know, but like if you look at like, say like the CPUSA in its heyday, there were a lot of rich women, like bourgeois women in the CPUSA. You know, like these things can happen, but you can't call that a class organization. That's a political cause that they're taking out, they're engaging in individually, right? Like it's like you can't have a socialist or communist party that's literally just made up of middle class intellectuals. Like if it doesn't have any working class basis, it's not a class organization other than just, you know, being a middle class, like, I don't know, wankery club, right?
Well, the only point I'll kind of satirically poke back on is that you can indeed have such an organization, and they do indeed exist. Like,
you can have it, but it doesn't fit.
It's not a coherent economic power organization. Yes, that's right.
Of what a class organization is, right?
It becomes a weird middle class cosplay festival. Yeah. The Canadian left is full of those organizations and parties, right?
Well, every left party in the history of ever has been full of intellectuals like that. It's just the ones that have only that they're not a political force. Yeah, okay, yeah, so yeah, we have Ralph Nader's "Only the Super Rich Can Save Us" book of 2009, when Nader was like, yo, have you considered getting Elon to bankroll Utopia?
I remember that was he was pitching that one very hard on Democracy Now! Back in my Democracy Now! My early leftist days. Okay, let me keep going and read this next bit of slide. Furthermore, we're continuing here. In effect, Mann argues that much of what class and stratification analysts study is of little sociological interest because they focus on the efforts of objective properties of the locations of people within social structures rather than the effects of collectively organized power actors. That to me just makes no sense. But Mann's dismissal of the analysis of objective properties of class relations would be compelling if it were the case that there were no systematic causal connections between these properties and the formation of collective power actors that are Mann's central concern. However, if the objective properties of the social relations of production make certain kinds of power organizations more likely and sustainable than others, class analysis should pay attention to both of these conceptual clusters. Like, when he takes it out of this idea of it coming out of the production relations and ownership relations, then he's just left with like no causal mechanism. It's nearly like these things are just they appear out of nowhere. You know, it's a very non-scientific approach.
They're clustered around economic rights, but the origin of those economic rights is a complete mystery.
Right.
Yeah, it just emerged out of the ether, like the endowments people have in neoclassical economic theory.
Right, it's the clumpiness of the universe after the Big Bang. That's what we're talking about.
I don't know, Tom. That sounds pretty objective to me. I look askance at that framework.
It's too materialist.
Yeah, it's too materialist. I think we should really just be focusing on the social conscious dimension of things.
Yeah, some kind of form of some sort of like a psychoaffective feeling that just emerges from the ether somehow. And
I would say it's actually like probably being beamed down to us from space aliens on the other side of the galaxy. That's probably where these class organizations are originating from.
Someone's beefing up on their simulation theory.
Yeah, it's like the Matrix, man. These are just the teams they put us on in this big game.
Okay, Bob, how do you feel about hitting up the middle class? Yeah, do you want to smack up the middle class here first?
I'll smack up the middle class. I'm happy you're throwing this one at me because I found this section very interesting. So yeah, Mann sums up his analysis of the middle class in 19th century capitalism thus. A middle class emerged with a distinctive relation to power resources with its own organizations and collective consciousness, a relation summed up by the impure dual formula, that's telling language, segmental, middling participation in organizations generated by the diffuse circuits of capital, and more independent, varied participation in the authoritative nation state. And then he goes on to talk about like all these various ways that, like the middle class comes to participate in organization, but then that is being partially structured, I guess, or determined by the very types of objective commonalities within these individuals and families within the relations of production that Mann formally rejects. That's very interesting. And I think it's very interesting that the idea that the class is impure, or that there's these sorts of impure organizations where it's like he's essentially doing an analysis. He's essentially doing an analysis of middle class formation that his own framework would reject. Is what right. And I love when I actually have to say, like, it's almost like his theory is less interesting than I don't know what you describe his analysis, because how Wright lays out how the middle class come to form common connections or common understanding themselves as a class, for instance, uniting members of the petit bourgeois, the professionals, and the careerists, I actually think is pretty on point. Very interesting, right? Like the fact that they have enough excess income to invest in speculative investments. I've seen that. That is how members of the petit bourgeois and the professionals come to become united with many members of the corporate class. Like I've seen that play out. And things like common family connections. And when he talks about connections, it's very similar types of family experiences. It sounds a lot like Bourdieu's habitus. Bourdieu being, I think, an interesting case of a kind of anti-Marxist intellectual who actually produces a lot of interesting theoretical concepts that are valuable to Marxism, in my opinion. Almost like he's not capable of understanding the implications of his own arguments, which is sort of what Mann is doing here. So I found that very interesting. What did you guys think about this section on the middle class, and what did you think about the description of the different ways the petit bourgeois, the careerists, these waged or salaried employees moving up the corporate ladder, and these professionals come to understand themselves or come to form commonalities as part of a class essentially for itself? Because I thought it was interesting.
I think the interesting thing to me right now from this framework is that, like, the middle class in America is actually very splintered. The careerists and professionals are Democrats for the most part, and the petit bourgeois are Republicans for the most part.
That's exactly right.
Fucking hate each other. The sort of, the hybrid nature of the class, the instability of the class, I feel has been pushed to like the extreme in America because of partially because of geographical factors, but also partially because of accidental political factors.
Like, couldn't you argue that we're seeing something similar sort of play out? Maybe, I mean, I guess this is very contentious, and I don't think anyone really knows how to think about this at the moment. But like in Canada, like the Freedom Convoy protests, right?
Oh,
It's like the real driving force, from what I can tell, behind that, it's like the petit bourgeois of the trucker industry. And they are just and they're allied
and other petit bourgeois, right? Like you look at the
restaurant owners, the shop owners.
Yeah, right? Like the biggest donors to the Freedom Convoy were people like, like firing range owners and RV sales owners and like these like very small scale capitalists for the most part. Yeah.
Just like the strongest supporters of Trump, people argue they were like the guy with the boat siding business that had no education, who tended to live in who were actually doing well in terms of where they were in terms of income distribution, but we're living in rapidly downwardly mobile regions of the United States. And it's like those people are now like fundamentally opposed politically to, the careerists and the professionals who have broken with as kind of like a sort of enlightened liberal managerial, like I don't want to say a managerial class, because I know that's a problematic framing, but like, their position within.
There's also a discussion we talked about when we read the 18th Brumaire, right, Tom, about in the 18th Brumaire where Marx lays out like why these different fractions of the middle class tend to be at odds with each other. And we should maybe like revisit that at some point, because it is pretty interesting. And basically it has to do with the relationship to the state and capital, where the careerists and professionals tend to benefit from the state in ways that the PB do not. This, really has a lot to do with why the Freedom Convoy or why the Republican Party is like middle class, but in a way that is very, very different from the middle class in the Democrats, who are allied with big capital and the state, because all of these different groups benefit from state regulation in the ways that the PB do not.
As demonstrated every time a convoy protester decks a CBC journalist.
Yeah, exactly. that is when the latent objective factors become subjective and then subsequently material.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that this is the tendency across capital, that like with kind of the defeat of like both the communists and the social democrats, and rate of profit coming in and reallocating production away, that all that capital ends up with is a fight between the petty bourgeois and the large corporations as our politics. That's what we get until the workers rise, if they can rise again. Like that is our politics, between like a woke
Woke capitalism.
Woke capital versus basically
the Trump horde.
Right. And you see the same thing, like, I've been looking at a lot of different types of media over the last few months, and you see it. It's the same thing in all of these different countries. They give out about like sexuality, transgender, all this stuff. Yeah, it's our politics until something new comes. That's the dynamic.
Yeah, and I think it like there's a lot of different factors, but the degree to which there is a division between town and country is strongly predictive of how severe the conflict would be. I think the more you have the division between town and country, the more extreme this politics becomes.
Just like it was stated in the classic Marxist text, Country Mouse, City Mouse.
Yeah.